Edith Monroe and Margot Ellis had been best friends for over 50 years until one summer afternoon, jealousy, obsession, and a decades-long affair turned their bond into a brutal betrayal that ended in bloodshed. Edith Monroe had always been the kind of woman people smiled at in the grocery store and waved to from their porches. At 64, she still kept her nails done, wore pearl earrings, and never left the house without spritzing on the same lavender perfume she'd worn since the 80s, her small cottage on Willow Lane looked like something from a magazine, flower beds always trimmed, porch swing polished, curtains pressed and pulled back just enough to see the warm light inside. But what no one saw behind that perfect presentation was a heart quietly growing bitter from years of secrets and silence. Edith wasn't living a peaceful retirement. She had become tangled in a dangerous web that she had spun herself, one filled with longing, lies, and love she was never supposed to have. For nearly 10 years, she had been the secret mistress of Franklin Dorsey, a 68-year-old man married to his high school sweetheart, Lorraine. In public, Frank was the man who helped neighbors with yard work, who donated to the local church fundraisers, and who still kissed his wife's cheek at Sunday service. But behind closed doors, he was someone entirely different, a man who whispered promises he didn't intend to keep and slipped into Edith's home when no one was watching. Their affair had started innocently enough, if such a thing could ever be innocent. Edith had once styled Lorraine's hair back when she ran her beauty parlor out of her garage. Frank had come by to pick his wife up one afternoon, and something about his charm, the way he smiled, how he touched her shoulder as he thanked her, had lingered. One flirtatious comment led to coffee. Coffee led to a picnic led to a kiss. Before long, they were deep into a relationship that had no future, only stolen moments. At first, Edith convinced herself it would all work out. Frank would leave Lorraine. They'd move to a quiet cabin by the lake like he always talked about. He said she made him feel alive again, like he was 25 and had the world ahead of him. But time passed, and Frank never left his wife. Every excuse seemed valid at first: Lorraine's health, his grown children, the fear of judgment. But as years went by, Edith began to feel like a fool. Yet she didn't walk away. Instead, she clung tighter, afraid to be alone, terrified that this messy love was the only spark she'd ever feel again. Only one person knew Edith well enough to notice the changes. Margot Ellis, her best friend since they were girls, had lived 2 doors down all her life. They shared everything growing up: secrets, heartbreaks, dreams of travel they never fulfilled. Even in their 60s, they still had morning coffee together on weekends and played cards every Thursday night. Margot had always been sharper than most. She knew when Edith was hiding something, even if she didn't say it out loud. Margot began to suspect something was off when Edith started canceling plans without explanation. She'd be home but wouldn't answer the door. She stopped attending community events, only to reappear days later with a new pair of shoes or jewelry she never explained. Once, Margot saw Frank's unmistakable truck parked outside Edith's house at night, engine off, windows fogged. She said nothing. But she started watching. Edith noticed the shift. Margot was no longer as open, her tone slightly cooler, her glances sharper. They still had coffee, but the silences between them grew longer. Edith began to feel paranoid. Did Margot know? Was she judging her, or worse, was she planning to tell Lorraine? Frank had warned her once that Margot was too nosy. He said their affair would only stay safe if no one talked. But the tension grew unbearable. Edith tried to cover it up with smiles and small gifts. She offered Margot an expensive scarf one day, something she claimed was an extra gift from a cousin. Margot accepted it, but her eyes said she didn't believe a word. Still, Edith clung to the hope that Margot wouldn't betray her. After all, they had been through everything together: failed marriages, family losses, financial struggles. If anyone understood loneliness, it was Margot. But obsession has a way of clouding judgment. And Edith's mind began spiraling. Every phone call Margot made was a threat. Every text was a possible leak. Every glance from a neighbor was suspicious. Her world, once small and safe, now felt like it was crumbling beneath her feet. One day, while going through her junk drawer, Edith found an old photo of her and Margot at the county fair, smiling with cotton candy in hand. She stared at it for hours. She missed that version of them, carefree, trusting, unbroken, but that version was long gone, replaced by a silent rivalry neither woman acknowledged. What Edith couldn't have known was that Margot had, in fact, told someone. Her younger sister, visiting from out of state, had listened to her suspicions late one night over wine. Margot wasn't even sure she was right. She hoped she wasn't. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Edith was hiding something dangerous. And once that seed was planted, it began to grow. In a town like Fairhaven, secrets are hard to keep. Margot's sister spoke to someone. Then that someone spoke to someone else. Within a week, the rumors started. Whispers in the pews, behind shelves at the market, at the post office counter. Edith felt it all at once. People stopped inviting her to events. Some didn't return her waves. She was no longer the charming older lady who gave hair tips. She was the woman people stared at from across the street. Then Frank stopped calling. He stopped visiting. One text from him read, "Too risky right now, need space." That silence from him was louder than any rumor. It echoed in her empty house, in every forgotten message, in every missed heartbeat. And so, the woman who once held her head high began to break. Not all at once, not with screams or tears, but quietly, with clenched fists and sleepless nights. The bitterness grew like rot inside her, eating away at what little hope she had left. She told herself it was Margot's fault. Margot had broken the code. Margot had turned on her. She replayed every moment of their friendship, twisting each one into a betrayal. A wrong word here, a suspicious glance there. It all made sense now. Edith convinced herself she had been set up. As summer approached and the roses in her front yard bloomed, Edith stopped tending them. She stopped smiling. She sat by her window every evening waiting for Frank's truck. It never came. What did come was a dangerous thought, creeping quietly into her mind. If Margot hadn't spoken, none of this would have happened. That thought stayed, it grew, and soon it became the only thing that made sense. The days that followed were thick with tension, like the heavy summer air pressing down on every rooftop in Fairhaven. Edith stopped answering her phone and barely left the house. She sat in her living room with the curtains half closed, watching the neighborhood go about its business, all while feeling like the world had quietly turned against her. Every friendly face now seemed suspicious. Every chuckle she overheard felt like it was at her expense. She didn't need confirmation that the rumors had spread. She felt it in her bones. She started noticing subtle things. The mailman, who once lingered to chat, now dropped the letters quickly and moved on. The couple from 2 doors down who always invited her to their 4th of July barbecue didn't even wave that week. At the grocery store, the clerk who'd always complimented her hair barely made eye contact. These were small details, but they added up. Edith understood how small towns worked. She knew once people got wind of scandal, it wasn't long before they built an entire narrative around it. Frank's silence was the cruelest cut of all. He hadn't called in 2 weeks, hadn't replied to the last 3 texts she'd sent. Edith scrolled through them obsessively, rereading his earlier messages that promised affection, a future, even freedom. He'd once said he couldn't imagine his life without her. Now it felt like he'd erased her existence completely. Her mind spiraled. Maybe Margot had told Lorraine. Maybe Lorraine had confronted Frank. Maybe he was being watched. Maybe he'd never really meant any of it. These questions ran circles around her thoughts day and night. She couldn't sleep. Her meals sat untouched. Her once pristine home began to show signs of neglect. Dishes piled up in the sink. Dust collected on the picture frames. She didn't care anymore. Not when everything felt like it was slipping away. But then a moment of clarity. Edith remembered the exact day the shift happened. It wasn't just the rumors. It wasn't just Frank. It was the moment she saw Margot walking into the little cafe on Main Street, laughing beside none other than Lorraine Dorsey. That image played over in Edith's head like a haunting reel. The 2 women had never been close. Their sudden camaraderie didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like conspiracy. That's when suspicion turned into certainty. Edith began tracking Margot's routines. She took long walks past her house. She scribbled notes on a calendar whenever she saw Margot leave or come home. She followed her car a few blocks one day, just to see where she went. Edith told herself it was just curiosity, but she knew better. It was surveillance. Her obsession grew. She dug through old photo albums, scrutinizing every picture of her and Margot. In each one, she searched for clues. Smiles that looked too forced, glances that might have hinted at jealousy. She convinced herself that Margot had always envied her. That deep down, Margot resented the attention Edith received from men, from the community, even from Frank. That resentment had simply bubbled to the surface once she found her opportunity. One afternoon, unable to control herself, Edith walked across the street and stood in front of Margot's trash bins just as the garbage truck pulled away. She opened the lid and began sifting through crumpled papers and food wrappers. It was madness, but she had to know. What she found was ordinary until she saw the envelope. A torn corner revealed part of a note written in Margot's handwriting. It wasn't anything conclusive, just a few scribbled lines about getting it off her chest and telling the truth. But to Edith, it was proof. She went home clutching the paper like it was gold. She paced her kitchen, rereading it 100 times, each time becoming more convinced that Margot had betrayed her. It didn't matter that it wasn't addressed to anyone specific. Edith's version of events had already taken shape. In her mind, Margot was the reason for everything. The gossip, Frank's disappearance, her public humiliation. That night, Edith opened a dusty old box in the attic and pulled out her late husband's belongings. Among them was a heavy hammer with a wooden handle, still stained from years of use. Her husband had died nearly 15 years ago, but Edith had never gotten rid of his tools. She cradled the hammer in her hands, staring at it like it held answers. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked like an object of purpose. Solid, final, she placed it beside her knitstand and sat in silence for hours. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional bark of a dog down the street. In that silence, Edith began making a plan. Not an elaborate one, not something from a detective novel. Just a simple plan born from desperation. Margot had to be stopped. She told herself it was about survival, that if Margot destroyed what little remained of her life, there would be nothing left to salvage. Frank wouldn't come back. The town would never forget. She'd be humiliated for the rest of her days, branded as the foolish old woman who thought she could compete with a man's wife and lost everything. That thought of growing older in loneliness, being pitied, mocked, abandoned, was more terrifying than anything else. In the days that followed, Edith grew oddly calm. She made Margot a peach pie, just like they used to share. She called her and suggested they spend a Saturday afternoon going through old boxes in the attic. A trip down memory lane, she called it. Margot agreed. Despite everything, despite the distance that had crept between them, she still held on to the threads of their lifelong friendship. Edith cleaned the attic that week. She made room near the back wall. She even placed a folding chair there, neatly set under a beam of dusty sunlight. It was quiet up there, hidden from the rest of the house. No one would hear anything. No one would interrupt. Each evening, Edith stood by the window and watched the sun dip below the rooftops, casting golden light over the quiet neighborhood. She watched Margot tend to her garden. She watched the same mailman drive by. The world looked the same, but nothing was, and as that Saturday approached, Edith felt a strange peace. Not because the storm was passing, but because she had already decided to become it. The morning of the planned visit began like any other in Fairhaven, birds chirping, sprinklers ticking across green lawns, and neighbors waving as they retrieved their newspapers. But inside Edith Monroe's house there was a stillness that felt unnatural. She moved slowly, deliberately, making sure every corner of the attic was in order. She dusted off the folding chair, adjusted the boxes around it to give the illusion of clutter, and placed a small fan in the corner to keep the air circulating. The hammer was hidden beneath a faded towel, tucked between an old blanket and a stack of books. She wore a soft blue cardigan, the one Margot had always complimented, and laid out 2 glasses of lemonade on the kitchen table as if this was just another visit between lifelong friends. There was no trace of panic on her face, no visible tension, only an eerie calm. Margot arrived a little after noon, just as they had agreed. She parked her car in the driveway and walked up to the porch carrying a small box of photographs she had found in her closet, thinking they might enjoy reminiscing. She was unsuspecting, warm, and smiling in that way only someone who still believes in forgiveness could be. Edith opened the door with a practiced smile, hugged her tightly, and welcomed her inside. They chatted briefly, sipping lemonade and sorting through the photo box. Old memories filled the space, pictures of childhood birthdays, school dances, weddings, long-forgotten vacations. Margot laughed at a picture of them in oversized sunglasses and sun hats, taken during a weekend trip to the lake in their 20s. For a moment, it felt real, like the years hadn't changed them, like betrayal hadn't torn through the very fabric of their bond. Then Edith mentioned the attic. She told Margot she had found another box of old keepsakes while cleaning, things from their high school days, maybe even some notes and letters they'd written each other. Margot agreed to go up, unaware that the attic was already prepared for her arrival. Edith led the way, climbing the narrow staircase with practiced ease. Margot followed, chatting casually about her sister's upcoming visit. She had no idea that each step was drawing her closer to the end. Inside the attic, the air was warm and thick with dust. The light from the single window fell across the floor in long stripes. Margot looked around, setting her photo box on a stack of crates. She bent over to look through a trunk filled with old journals and yearbooks. That's when Edith moved behind her. There was no warning, no hesitation, just a sharp swing of the hammer. The first strike hit the back of Margot's head. She collapsed instantly, her body falling sideways with a soft thud onto the attic floor. Edith froze for a moment, staring at what she had done. Then, with trembling hands, she struck again. The second blow wasn't out of anger, it was finality. She had committed to this course and there was no turning back. Blood soaked into the dusty floorboards. The sound of the fan hummed on, indifferent. Outside, the world went on as if nothing had happened. Edith stood over Margot's body, breathing heavily, sweat running down her neck. Her cardigan was stained. Her hands shook as she dropped the hammer and backed into the corner, her mind racing. Panic crept in now. It was done, but what came next? She had no real plan for disposal. In her fantasies, the moment had always ended with peace, not logistics. But now, faced with the reality of death, she understood the horror of what she'd done. Still, she moved into action. She wrapped Margot's body in a faded quilt and dragged it down the attic stairs, each step grating beneath the weight. The process took nearly an hour. Her arms ached, her back screamed, but adrenaline kept her going. She pulled the bundle through the hallway and out the back door, carefully avoiding the view of neighbors. Her shed, tucked behind the overgrown hydrangeas, had a broken lock no one ever bothered to fix. She opened it and pushed the body inside, hiding it behind boxes of gardening supplies and a rolled-up rug. The hammer was cleaned with bleach and placed in a toolbox. Her cardigan was buried at the bottom of her laundry hamper. She scrubbed the attic floor until her knees went numb. By nightfall, she had erased almost every visible trace of the crime, at least in her eyes, but nothing ever disappears completely. That evening, Margot's sister called, confused. She hadn't heard from Margot all day. She'd texted no reply. Called no answer. Edith answered the phone with calm concern, telling her that Margot had never arrived for their visit. She even offered to help look. When Margot's car was found in Edith's driveway the next morning, unlocked and untouched, alarms began to ring. The police were called. Officers arrived and knocked on Edith's door. She greeted them with a soft, sad face, claiming Margot must have changed her mind or left without saying anything. She said maybe Margot had gone for a walk and gotten distracted. Maybe she had plans no one knew about. The officers searched the property. The attic revealed nothing. The house was spotless, but the shed was locked. Edith claimed she hadn't used it in years, said the roof leaked and animals got in. But the smell betrayed her. When they forced the door open, the officers found the rolled quilt, the broken chair, the blood-stained gardening gloves. Within minutes, the entire scene shifted. Crime scene tape went up. Neighbors gathered outside in stunned silence. The shed that once held garden tools now held the shattered truth of a decades-long friendship turned deadly. Edith was arrested without resistance. She didn't cry, she didn't shout. She only asked for a moment to sit before being led away. In her silence, she looked almost relieved, as if the storm she had carried for so long had finally broken. The news spread fast. A 64-year-old woman, once beloved in her community, had murdered her best friend over an affair with a married man. It didn't sound real. It sounded like a story from a faraway place, not something born in the quiet streets of Fairhaven. But the evidence was undeniable. The autopsy confirmed blunt force trauma. The hammer, once thought to be hidden well, had traces of blood missed by Edith's cleaning. Her fingerprints were everywhere. The quilt, the rug, even the attic steps bore signs of the struggle she thought she had erased. As she sat in the back of the police cruiser, staring at the house she'd once made a home, Edith finally understood the weight of what she'd done. Not just the murder, but the life she had destroyed long before. Margot ever walked into that attic. Hers, Margot's, Frank's, all burned to ash, in the name of a love that was never truly hers to begin with. In the days that followed Edith's arrest, Fairhaven became a town unrecognizable to its residents. The quiet peace that once defined the neighborhood had been ripped apart by a crime so brutal, so unexpected that people began to question everything they thought they knew about those around them. Edith Monroe, the sweet older woman with roses in her yard and casseroles in her freezer, was now the subject of hushed whispers and wide-eyed glances. Her name, once spoken with fondness, now echoed in grocery store aisles and over fence-line conversations with disbelief and dread. The police wasted no time piecing together the case. With Margot's body found in Edith's shed, the investigation had a clear starting point. Detectives scoured the property for anything Edith might have missed. They discovered traces of blood on the attic floorboards, despite her thorough attempt at cleaning. A few strands of Margot's hair had stuck to the base of the folding chair. The hammer, although wiped clean, still held microscopic remnants of blood and tissue that matched the victim. More damning, however, was the digital trail. On Edith's phone, they uncovered messages to Frank Dorsey, dozens of them, spanning years. Some were filled with affection, others with longing, and the most recent ones with desperation. It became clear that Edith's mental state had begun unraveling as Frank grew more distant. Her texts were no longer romantic, but pleading, some bordered on obsessive. One stood out: "She knows everything. I won't let her ruin this." Investigators didn't need to guess who she was. The diary found in Edith's nightstand sealed the narrative. Inside its pages was a detailed record of her thoughts, fears, and most alarmingly her fixation on Margot. In one entry, Edith wrote that Margot had been watching too closely and inviting danger into what was once sacred. Another entry mentioned a plan to stop the poison before it spreads. There was no direct mention of murder, but the implications were chilling and clear. As the news outlets picked up the story, the town's image was shattered. Reporters from nearby cities arrived to film outside Edith's house, their cameras zooming in on the yellow police tape and faded porch swing. Anchors read headlines with words like brutal, obsessed, and deadly betrayal. People who had never heard of Fairhaven now knew it as the town where a 64-year-old woman killed her best friend over a married man. Frank Dorsey was eventually pulled into the public spotlight. Though he had vanished in the early days of the investigation, police located him living temporarily in a motel outside of town. When brought in for questioning, he admitted to the affair, claiming it had been a secret burden he tried to end several times. He said Edith had become possessive and unstable in the final months, but he had no idea she would ever commit violence. His testimony would later serve as a key part of the prosecution's case. When the time came for the trial, the courthouse was filled to capacity. Locals lined up for a seat inside. The story had taken on a life of its own, more than just a crime. It was a tragedy that blurred the line between love and madness. People who had once shared baked goods and gossip with Edith now listened in stunned silence as the prosecution laid out their evidence. The prosecution focused on motive. They painted Edith as a woman so consumed by her delusions of love and fear of abandonment that she saw murder as the only way to control her crumbling reality. The affair had isolated her, but it was the perceived betrayal by Margot that ignited the violence. The diary entries, the blood evidence, and the texts to Frank created a clear timeline that led to Margot's death. Edith's defense attorneys had little to work with. They portrayed her as a woman emotionally manipulated by a man who promised a future he never intended to provide. They argued that years of secrecy, shame, and emotional neglect had broken something inside her. They stopped short of pleading insanity, but leaned heavily on diminished capacity. Still, the jury remained unconvinced. During the trial, a series of witnesses testified. Margot S.'s sister gave a heartbreaking statement about the final phone call she received and the message Margot left that day. She spoke about the years of friendship between the two women and the cruel irony of Margot's death at the hands of someone she trusted more than anyone. Friends and neighbors took the stand as well, recalling Edith's changing behavior in the months leading up to the murder, her paranoia, her isolation, her subtle bitterness. Perhaps the most powerful moment came when Frank was called to the stand. He walked into the courtroom looking older than his 68 years, his face pale and sunken. He described the affair with measured words, trying to downplay its emotional weight. He said he'd never meant to hurt anyone and that he had tried to end it more than once. But the courtroom grew tense when he admitted that he never told Edith he loved her, only that she made him feel young again. His testimony didn't bring sympathy. If anything, it reinforced the picture of a man who used charm to escape accountability, leaving behind destruction in his wake. After 5 days of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Edith Monroe was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, noting the brutal nature of the crime and the betrayal involved, sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no emotion as the sentence was read. She stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, looking not at the judge or the jury, but at the floor beneath her feet. Following the trial, Edith was transferred to a state correctional facility where she was placed in a segregated unit for older inmates. Her days became slow and silent. She spoke to no one. She received no visitors. The woman who once hosted holiday dinners and gave hair advice now spent her time staring out a barred window, counting the cracks in the concrete walls. Back in Fairhaven, the community struggled to return to normal. Margot's house was emptied by her sister and quietly sold months later. Edith's cottage remained vacant, overgrown with weeds and silent shadows. No one dared step inside. The children in the neighborhood whispered about it being haunted. Adults avoided even walking past. For some, the story became a warning about the dangers of secrets and unchecked emotions. For others, it was simply too dark to talk about. But no matter how the town chose to cope, the facts remained. 2 lives were lost, one to murder, the other to obsession. And in a place where everyone thought they knew each other, this crime left a permanent scar. One that no rosebush or painted fence could ever fully cover. Months passed after the sentencing, and the story of Edith Monroe and Margot Ellis began to drift from the headlines. The news vans left. The reporters moved on to fresher scandals. But in Fairhaven, the weight of what happened never really disappeared. It clung to the town like fog in the early morning, quiet and thick, making people speak in softer voices and glance over their shoulders a little more than they used to. Edith's house on Willow Lane stood empty, its shutters sagging and paint peeling under the heat of the southern sun. The once pristine garden grew wild, rosebush tangled with weeds, ivy creeping up the front steps. No one wanted to live there. Realtors tried, offering low prices and incentives, but the house had a reputation now. Children dared each other to knock on the front door at night. Adults crossed the street rather than walk past. The home that had once represented warmth and neighborly charm was now a relic of something grim, a monument to how darkness can grow behind the most beautiful curtains. In the state correctional facility 2 hours away, Edith became known as the quiet one. She never caused trouble. She didn't speak unless spoken to. The other women in her unit learned quickly to leave her alone. There was something unsettling about the way she stared out the window for hours, unmoving as if she were waiting for something that would never come. She refused to attend group therapy. She declined visits, not that anyone ever signed up to see her. Her world had collapsed the moment the truth was laid bare in court, and now all that remained was routine, gray, empty, repetitive. Every morning she rose before the others, made her bed with military precision, and sat by the window as the sun climbed over the compound walls. She didn't read books, she didn't write letters, she just existed, silent and ghost-like. Sometimes she'd hum old songs under her breath, barely audible, tunes from decades ago that only she seemed to remember. It wasn't madness. It was something colder, resignation. She knew there was nothing waiting for her outside those walls. No forgiveness, no sympathy, no redemption. Only time. Frank Dorsey, the man at the center of it all, left town shortly after the trial ended. He sold his house quietly and moved to Florida. Some said he was trying to start over. Others believed he was simply running from the shame. He filed for divorce from Lorraine 2 weeks after Edith's conviction. The paperwork went through without a word from her. She had nothing to say to him. Their decades of marriage dissolved quietly, the final casualty of a story that had already destroyed so much. Lorraine stayed in Fairhaven for a while, but eventually moved in with her sister across the state. She no longer attended church, avoided the grocery store where whispers still lingered, and cut off contact with most of her old friends. Her grief wasn't loud. It was the kind that settles deep and refuses to leave, not because her husband had an affair, but because someone had died for it. That kind of guilt touched everyone involved, whether they admitted it or not. Margot's sister Elaine became the voice for her memory. She organized a memorial at the town library, where photos of Margot's life were displayed, her childhood, her volunteer work, her love of gardening, and the dozens of people she quietly helped over the years. It wasn't a grand event, but it was filled with warmth. Those who attended shared stories, small but meaningful moments that painted a picture of who Margot truly was beyond the headlines. Elaine spoke with a quiet strength, reminding everyone that her sister had died not as a victim of scandal, but of misplaced trust. The town tried to move on, but things had changed in subtle ways. People became more cautious about who they let into their homes, more guarded in their conversations. A kind of distance grew among neighbors who once shared barbecues and birthday parties. No one said it aloud, but there was a collective fear. If something so horrific could come from two old friends in their 60s, what else might be hiding in the lives of others? For those closest to the tragedy, healing came slowly, if at all. Elaine started a foundation in Margot's name, focused on mental health support for older adults. She believed, perhaps stubbornly, that if someone had noticed the warning signs in Edith earlier, things could have been different. The foundation offered resources, phone lines, and support groups for those dealing with isolation, grief, and obsessive thoughts. Whether it helped or not was unclear, but it gave purpose to a life torn by loss. Back in prison, Edith never spoke of Margot, not to staff, not to other inmates, not to herself. The name was never uttered. But every spring, when the warden allowed inmates to spend a morning in the courtyard garden, Edith would pause beside a patch of blooming white flowers. No one else seemed to notice the significance, but she did. They were the same kind Margot used to grow by her front steps. Edith never touched them, never stayed long, but her gaze lingered just a few seconds longer than anywhere else. It was the only sign that something still lived inside her, memory, regret, or something she couldn't name. In time, new stories took over the town's attention. People married, children were born, businesses opened and closed. But the name Edith Monroe remained a permanent part of Fairhaven's darker history. Mentioned quietly, often with a shake of the head or a heavy sigh, she had been one of them. A friend, a neighbor, a familiar face. And then she wasn't. The tragedy remained not just because of its violence, but because of what it revealed. That no one truly knew the hearts of others. That love, when twisted by obsession, could become something terrifying. That friendship, even decades strong, could fracture under the weight of secrets and jealousy. And so the house on Willow Lane stayed empty, the paint peeled. The roses wilted. But sometimes someone passing by would stop for just a second, glance at the dusty porch, and remember. Not just the crime, but the women, one who died believing in a bond that should have protected her, and one who let love turn into something so consuming that it destroyed everything it touched.